Love is not just for this world. If you want to discover feelings that transcend boundaries, subscribe now. Empress Zelzuran stood upon the command deck of her warship, a monolith of dark chitin and pulsing machinery, the air thick with the scent of ionized metal and something colder, something ancient. The vessel, Imperium's Vow, drifted in the silent void, a fortress in the dark, an extension of her own indomitable will. The glow of starlight filtered through the reinforced viewports, casting jagged patterns along the walls, reflecting against the glossy black of her exoskeleton. Her form was a masterpiece of evolution, towering over all, her armored limbs moving with eerie precision, her multifaceted eyes absorbing every detail with ruthless clarity. She was not merely a queen, she was the queen, the apex of her kind, ruler of the Zyon Dominion, the mother of empires. And yet, something was wrong. The vastness before her should have inspired satisfaction, a sense of mastery over all she surveyed. Instead, it felt hollow. Her empire, once the unstoppable tide of the cosmos, had slowed. The great fleets no longer pushed further into the void, their conquests grinding to a halt. The corridors of her warships had grown quieter. The birthing chambers of the royal castes, once brimming with life, had become tombs of stillborn eggs. It was a slow decay, almost imperceptible, but undeniable. Braxia was dying. Her claws clicked against the polished floor as she moved toward the center of the chamber, where a holographic projection of the Empire flickered and spun, a vast, web-like sprawl of dominion and control. Once, it had been a thing of beauty. Now it showed something else. Weakness. Stagnation. A species that had reached the peak of its perfection, only to find that perfection meant an end. The High Council had whispered of solutions, forced expansions, genetic modifications, increased warrior breeding, but none had worked. None had reversed the trend. The universe, vast and ever-changing, had begun to move past them. And that was the one thing Zelzuran could not tolerate. A sound behind her broke her thoughts. The doors to the command chamber slid open with a hiss, and in stepped Sershkal, her most trusted lieutenant. His broad form was etched with the deep ridges of an aging warrior, his black armor marked with the scars of countless battles. He was one of the few she trusted, trusted to be strong, trusted to be ruthless, trusted to obey. And yet, there was something about the way he hesitated before speaking that made her mandibles tighten. "Empress," he said, inclining his head, "the human has been secured." Zelzuran turned, her gaze shifting to the figure that stood between two of her guards, a frail, insignificant thing, bound at the wrists, yet standing upright, head unbowed. Dr. Ethan Graves, a human scientist, a prisoner of war, taken not for ransom or negotiation, but because there was something about his species that intrigued the Vraxians. They were weak, brittle. Their bodies lacked the armor of true warriors, their bones fragile compared to the reinforced skeletal structures of superior species. But somehow they endured. They spread across hostile worlds with reckless persistence, surviving where others perished. They fought wars against stronger foes and won, not through brute force, but through something more insidious. Adaptability. Zelzuran had studied them, had dissected them, had crushed them underfoot. Yet the more she observed, the less sense it made. Their evolution was chaotic, undirected. And yet, that very chaos had allowed them to thrive, while other species like her own, remained trapped in their rigid perfections. She took a slow step forward, towering over the human. His breathing was controlled, his expression unreadable, though she could smell the adrenaline beneath his skin. A lesser creature would have cowered, but Graves was watching her, studying her. "The reports suggest your species is difficult to kill," she said, her voice smooth, measured. "Yet your bodies are fragile. Your bones break, your flesh tears, your lifespans are brief. How do you account for this contradiction?" Graves held a gaze. "You see fragility," he said, his voice steady. "I see adaptability." Zelzuran tilted her head, considering him. "Elaborate." "You've made yourselves perfect," he continued, voice sharp, dissecting. And perfection is stagnation. Your people stopped changing, stopped evolving. That's why your birth rates are falling. Your genetics have nowhere left to go. You're a species that's optimized itself into a corner. His lips curled into the hint of a smile. Humans, though, we change. We mutate. We adapt. We survive. That's what keeps us going, even when everything else says we shouldn't. Surgical growled low in his throat. You dare speak to the Empress this way? Graves didn't flinch. If she didn't want to hear the answer, she wouldn't have asked. Zalzyran felt something unusual then. Not anger, not amusement, but something colder. Something dangerously close to curiosity. An interesting theory, she said. Flawed, of course. He shrugged. That's what science is for. She chuckled, a deep, resonant sound. You believe your species possesses something mine does not. I believe we have something you've lost. The words hung between them, a challenge wrapped in certainty. Surgical shifted beside her. Shall I dispose of him, Empress? No, Zalzyran's eyes did not leave Graves. We will test his theory. Surgical hesitated. You mean to? I mean to see if this adaptability he boasts of is truly so extraordinary, she said, her voice low, thoughtful. I will take his resilience and make it mine. For the first time, a flicker of uncertainty crossed Graves' face. And how exactly do you plan to do that? She leaned closer, her towering form casting him in shadow. You claim your kind can endure anything. Let's find out if that's true. A slow smile spread across her face, mandibles twitching in amusement. Surgical looked uneasy now, but he did not question her. The guard seized Graves by the arms, dragging him from the chamber. He did not struggle, but his eyes remained locked on hers, unflinching. For the first time in her reign, Empress Zalzyran was uncertain of the outcome. As the door sealed shut behind them, she exhaled slowly, curling her claws into her palms. Something was shifting. She could feel it. Whether it was the beginning of her salvation or her undoing, she did not yet know. But she would find out. And if the human was right, then she would no longer be the most dangerous creature in the Empire. The laboratory exuded an eerie sterility, a space where no chaos had ever been allowed to exist. The walls pulsed faintly, a sign of the ship's living technology, its bioluminescent veins coursing with silent energy. It was neither warm nor cold, neither welcoming nor hostile. It simply was a place of absolute control, much like the woman who ruled it. Dr. Ethan Graves stood at the center of the room, his wrists no longer bound but still bearing the faint imprint of the dark alloy cuffs. He resisted the urge to rub the irritated skin. Any sign of discomfort would be noted, analyzed, cataloged for future use. The Empress was watching. Zalzyran had not moved since unlocking his restraints. She stood as she always did, poised like a monolithic statue, her chitinous armor gleaming in the sterile light. Her stillness was unnerving. Not the absence of motion, but the presence of restraint, as if she could obliterate him in an instant, but had simply chosen, for now, not to. Her gaze was unreadable, but Graves knew she was assessing him, not just as a specimen, but as something else. A question that had not yet formed in her mind. You are unafraid, she observed, voice smooth as dark stone. Graves lifted his shoulders in a slow, deliberate shrug. Should I be? The machinery around them whirred to life. From the ceiling, a ring of silver limbs descended, each tipped with an array of delicate instruments. Some bristled with scanners, others ended in wickedly thin needles, and one, an articulated limb with claw-like pincers, clicked experimentally as if testing its own precision. Zalzyran took a step closer, the quiet impact of her footfall betraying the immense weight she carried in her towering form. Her mandibles twitched in faint amusement. You misunderstand, human. Fear is not a failing. It is an indicator of intelligence. She gestured to the machinery as a mechanical arm extended toward him. What we are about to do should alarm you. Graves barely glanced at the device. You're testing my resilience, not killing me. A single slow blink. A pause. Then, a flicker of something in her dark eyes. Curiosity, perhaps even approval. No, she admitted. Not yet. The machinery adjusted, one of the sleek silver arms pressing a cold instrument against his skin. A pulse of energy hummed through him, mapping his vitals, his body temperature, the rhythm of his heartbeat. Data flickered across a translucent screen. Numbers shifted, colors adjusted. A silent, alien language measuring his worth. A second arm extended, this one ending in a thin, curved blade. Graves forced himself to remain still. The blade did not hesitate. A single, clean incision along the forearm. Not deep, but enough to spill crimson. The wound was precise, surgical in its intent, neither violent nor careless. Just a question, carved in flesh. The blood dripped onto the smooth black floor, vanishing as the ship absorbed the foreign material for analysis. Graves exhaled slowly, watching as his body reacted, platelets rushing to the site, clotting the wound in mere moments. Fascination flickered across Zalzaran's face, a shadow of an expression barely formed before it was buried beneath the weight of her composure. "You heal quickly," she murmured. "Not as quickly as some species," Graves countered, flexing his fingers as the cut sealed itself. "But fast enough." The scanners recalibrated, adjusting their readings. Zalzaran tilted her head, her layered vision processing the results at a speed no human could match. "Your biology is in constant flux. That's how we survive," Graves said simply. "We change faster than the things trying to kill us." She reached out, not with hesitation, but with deliberate intent. One clawed finger pressed against his chest, just above his heart, the sharp tip resting lightly against fabric, not yet piercing the skin. He could feel the weight behind it, the sheer strength restrained beneath control. "We are a species of certainty," she said, voice low. "We master our own evolution. We choose what we become. You," she narrowed her gaze. "You are chaos." Graves held her stare. "Chaos isn't always destruction," he said evenly. "Sometimes it's evolution." A long silence stretched between them. Then a shift. The machine monitoring him suddenly pulsed red. A warning tone, low, resonant. Zalzaran's mandibles clicked. An expression of displeasure or interest. He couldn't tell. The glowing alien script flickered erratically, as if struggling to define what it was seeing. The machinery had expected a pattern. It had not found one. Zalzaran stepped back, observing the data with something dangerously close to uncertainty. The screen pulsed, adjusting, recalibrating. His biological markers shifted. Expected blood toxicity levels were off. Cellular regeneration rates fluctuated faster than predicted. "What is this?" she murmured. Graves exhaled sharply, feeling an odd heat crawl beneath his skin. The drug. Whatever they had introduced into his bloodstream, his body wasn't reacting to it normally. Instead of dampening his system, it was adapting, adjusting, redirecting. The pulse in his veins quickened. His breath slowed, controlled. His body was compensating for an unknown variable faster than it should have. A muscle in Zalzaran's jaw tightened. She had expected something predictable. This was not that. "Your species should not exist," she said softly. Graves smirked, though the heat in his bloodstream was becoming impossible to ignore. "You said that already." The Empress did not respond. Her gaze remained fixed on the screen. The number should have settled by now. The pattern should have emerged. But the system kept shifting, recalibrating, failing to predict what came next. That was the moment he saw it. True hesitation. Not fear. Not yet. But something close. Zalzaran stepped away from the console, her gaze flicking to Scarel, who had stood silent throughout the exchange. The warrior's mandibles twitched, unreadable. "Return him to his quarters," she commanded. The guards moved immediately, their grip firm but not rough. Graves didn't resist. As they led him from the lab, he glanced once more at the Empress. She was still watching the data, but her expression had changed. It was no longer just curiosity. It was calculation. Something had shifted, and she knew it. He let a small smile play at the corner of his lips as he was escorted away. Zalzaran had tested him, but in doing so, she had been tested as well. And she had not liked the answer. The containment chamber had never felt small before, but now, as Ethan Graves sat on the metallic bench, the space seemed to close around him. The air remained sterile, void of scent or warmth, and the walls pulsed faintly with the slow, rhythmic glow of the ship's organic systems. He had never been claustrophobic, but something about the silence, the stillness, felt different now. It wasn't the isolation that bothered him. It was the uncertainty. His body had absorbed whatever they had injected into him, and instead of breaking down under its effects, he had adjusted, adapted. Graves had always considered himself relatively healthy, but he wasn't supposed to be this good at surviving. His body had folded something foreign into its biology, as if it belonged there, and Zalziran had noticed. Her reaction had been brief, almost imperceptible. A flicker of tension, a hesitation. But hesitation meant something when it came from her. The door hissed open. He looked up as Scarel stepped inside, the massive warrior moving with the kind of deliberate slowness that suggested he was in control of the situation, and he knew it. His dark armor reflected the chamber's dim light, his mandibles clicking once as he regarded Graves with the impassive gaze of a soldier carrying out orders he didn't need to question. "You will come with me." It wasn't a request. Graves stood, rolling his shoulders. "Any chance I get to ask where we're going first?" Scarel didn't answer. "Of course not." With a resigned sigh, Graves followed him through the door and into the corridor beyond. The Vraxian ship stretched out in both directions, its walls lined with a faint, bioluminescent glow. It was eerily quiet, a stillness that wasn't just the absence of noise, but the deliberate design of something meant to function without waste, without excess, without disorder. Every panel, every curve of the ship's organic metal walls felt purposeful, as though the vessel itself had been grown rather than built. Graves had seen alien ships before, but nothing quite like this. It wasn't just advanced, it was controlled. Scarel led him through a series of corridors, the silence stretching between them. If the warrior was displeased with escorting a human prisoner, he didn't show it. His pace was steady, his posture disciplined. Then, without warning, the hallway opened into something unexpected. The council chamber. Graves had expected another lab, maybe an interrogation room. Instead, he was led into a vast, circular hall with towering walls that shifted with faint, silver patterns. Some kind of living metal, constantly reconfiguring itself in subtle, unreadable ways. A massive curved table stretched across the center, its surface etched with intricate markings that pulsed faintly, responding to unseen inputs. But it wasn't the architecture that caught his attention. It was the people. 6 Vraxians stood at the table, their exoskeletal armor more ornate than Scarel's, their movements sharp with authority rather than strength. Advisors, leaders, judges. And at the far end of the room, standing apart, was Zalziran. She did not sit, did not lean, did not betray anything that might suggest vulnerability. She was an immovable force, her eyes dark and layered, taking in everything and revealing nothing. Graves had seen her in control before, but this was different. This was politics. Scarel stepped aside, taking his place near the entrance. The doors sealed shut behind them. The adjudicator in the center was taller than the others, his exoskeleton marked with deep crimson streaks that ran down his arms. When he spoke, his voice carried the kind of weight that suggested it was rarely challenged. "The Empress has brought forth an anomaly," he said, his gaze settling on Graves like an insect under a magnifying lens. "A biological deviation that does not conform to our expectations." Graves smiled faintly, flattered. The adjudicator ignored him. "Her Majesty's findings suggest that your physiology is inherently unstable," he continued. "Your biological markers shift beyond standard projections. Your body rejects foreign substances, but not through immunity, through integration. This is unnatural." Zalziran's expression did not change. Unstable and adaptable are not the same. The adjudicator's mandibles twitched in mild displeasure. "Perhaps, but unpredictability is dangerous." Graves tilted his head, his mind already working through the conversation. This wasn't a scientific discussion. This was a power struggle. They weren't afraid of him. They were afraid of what he represented. "You're worried because I don't fit into a neat little box," he said, folding his arms. "You've built a society around precision and order. And now something doesn't match. The Dominion does not tolerate variables." Another adjudicator interjected, his tone sharp. Graves exhaled slowly. "Then you must hate time itself." The adjudicator stiffened. "Explain." Graves glanced at Zalzyran, but she gave nothing away. He turned back to the council. "Your empire master control. You engineered yourselves into perfection. But evolution doesn't wait for permission. It happens whether you like it or not." The chamber fell into silence. Zalzyran watched him carefully, but she did not speak. The first adjudicator turned back to her. "The council does not share your interest in this experiment, Empress. If his biology cannot be controlled, it must be eliminated." Graves kept his posture relaxed, but his mind was already calculating. Not unexpected, but not ideal. A deliberate pause. "And what do you propose?" Zalzyran asked, her voice carrying no inflection. "Dissection," the adjudicator said simply. "A full analysis at the genetic level." There it was. Graves knew he had seconds before a decision was made. He didn't move, didn't react. He only watched Zalzyran, and she did not react immediately. But something shifted in her stance. A hesitation, a flicker of thought, then a choice. "No." The word cut through the room like a blade. The adjudicator stiffened. "Empress, this experiment is not yet concluded," she interrupted, her voice controlled but firm. "I will not discard a resource before its potential is fully realized." A ripple of unease passed through the council. The adjudicator regarded her carefully. "You are aware of what this implies." "I am." Graves filed away every nuance, every pause. This wasn't just about him. The tension in the room wasn't the tension of a ruler giving orders. It was the tension of a ruler defying expectation. Zalzyran turned back to him, her gaze steady. "You will remain under my authority until I determine what you are." Graves smirked. "I'd say I'm honored, but I don't think that's quite true." A faint twitch of her mandibles. Almost amusement. Almost. She turned to the adjudicators. "This meeting is concluded." One by one, they inclined their heads, though not without reluctance. The air in the room did not relax, but something shifted. As the doors slid open again, Surgical gestured for Graves to follow. He did, but not before glancing back at Zalzyran. She was still watching him, still calculating, still deciding if she had just made a mistake. The door to his quarters sealed behind him with a whisper of compressed air, leaving Ethan Graves alone once more. The Vraxians were efficient in their containment methods. No excess security detail, no overt hostility, just the unspoken reminder that he was being watched. He exhaled slowly, rubbing his wrist where the restraints had once been. The skin had already lost any sign of irritation. He should have been relieved. Instead, unease settled at the edges of his mind, threading itself into his thoughts like an unwanted guest. Zalzyran had chosen to protect him. That, more than anything, was what disturbed him. He had expected hostility, expected the cold efficiency of an empire that had master control. What he had not expected was hesitation. She had hesitated. That single moment, brief but undeniable, had changed something, not just in the council chamber, but between them. Graves paced the small confines of his quarters, his mind dissecting the meeting, replaying every movement, every silence. The adjudicators had been clear. They saw him as a problem, a biological deviation that did not conform to their rigid expectations. And yet, she had refused to let them dissect him. Why? A knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. It was not the sharp, calculated rhythm of a guard. It was measured, deliberate, a request rather than a command. Graves turned. The panel slid open. Zalzyran stepped inside, the space seeming to shrink in her presence. She did not speak immediately, merely observed, her dark, layered eyes scanning the room as if cataloging every detail before settling on him. "I assume this is not a social visit," he said. She ignored the remark, stepping further inside. The door shut behind her. For the first time since their interactions began, there was no audience, no guards, No silent observers lurking at the edges of the room. Just them. Zalziran regarded him for a long moment before speaking. The council believes I have made an error. Graves smirked. That makes two of us. She did not react to the comment, nor did she move closer. Instead, she tilted her head, studying him as she had before, but this time, something was different. You confuse them, she said finally. Your biology is unlike anything we have encountered. I get that a lot. She narrowed her gaze. Do you understand what that means? Graves folded his arms. I'm guessing it means they don't like what they can't predict. They do not fear unpredictability, she corrected. They fear irreversibility. That gave him pause. She continued, her voice level but edged with something almost unreadable. Our species has controlled its evolution for millennia. We select what we become. Every advancement is deliberate, calculated. She took a step closer, and Graves resisted the urge to take one back. You are not deliberate, she said. You are not controlled. You change in response to chaos rather than eliminating it. That is why they wanted you destroyed. Graves exhaled, considering her words. And you? Why didn't you let them? For the first time, something flickered in her expression. Not doubt, but curiosity. I do not know, she admitted. The honesty in the statement was more unsettling than any calculated answer would have been. Silence stretched between them. Zalziran turned, her gaze shifting to the walls, the faint pulsing of the ship's living metal reflecting in her dark eyes. Our empire is failing. The words were spoken not as an admission, but as a simple, undeniable fact. You already suspect this. Graves didn't answer. He didn't have to. She faced him again. We have bred out weakness, removed unpredictability. But perfection comes at a cost. We have not adapted because we have not needed to. Her gaze dropped, just briefly, to his forearm, where she had seen his body recover from the wound she had inflicted earlier. Until now. Graves frowned. You think my kind is the answer? I think your kind is a question, she said. One we have yet to solve. He let out a slow breath. And what happens if you don't like the answer? Her expression remained unreadable. Then we will adjust accordingly. The words sent a chill down his spine, not because they were spoken with threat, but because they were spoken without it. It was not a promise of violence, nor an attempt at intimidation. It was simply the truth. She moved toward the door, pausing just before it opened. You believe adaptability is strength, she said. That may be true. She turned her head slightly, just enough to glance at him. But control is survival. And then she was gone. The door sealed behind her, leaving Graves alone once more. He exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. This was no longer just about his survival. It was about hers. The ship drifted through the silent abyss, its living walls pulsing in slow, rhythmic waves. The air within its corridors remained cool and measured, neither too warm nor too cold, as if designed to suppress the concept of discomfort altogether. Yet discomfort lingered. It clung to the edges of the unseen, in the things unsaid, in the glances held too long. In the way Zalziran had stood at his door the night before and left without offering a command. Ethan Graves had spent his life studying alien species, peeling apart their biology, their cultures, their logic. He had learned to predict them, to place their behaviors into patterns. But the Vraxians resisted categorization. Or perhaps, it was Zalziran alone who refused to fit. Now, as he was escorted down another long corridor, he considered that thought carefully. Sershkol led him in silence, the warrior's imposing form moving with the effortless certainty of someone who did not question his place in the world. Unlike his empress, that was the part that still unsettled Graves. She had hesitated. He had seen it in the council chamber, felt it in the weight of her words when she chose to spare him. And for all her mastery over control, something beneath her polished exterior had cracked, however briefly. They reached a set of doors that parted without a sound. Beyond them was a laboratory, not the one from before. This one was deeper into the ship, hidden from the meticulous sterility of the upper decks. The lighting was dimmer, casting long shadows across the equipment. The air felt denser, heavier with the hum of unseen energy. Zalziran stood at the center, facing a towering pillar of translucent material, its surface shifting with data streams too fast for human eyes to follow. The glow from the display bathed her exoskeleton in pale silver, making her seem less like a monarch and more like a construct of cold logic, a creature carved from the very essence of her ship. She did not turn as they entered. Surshkul moved to the side, taking up a post against the wall, guarding but not intervening. Graves stepped forward, folding his arms. So, am I finally getting answers? Or is this another test? Zalziren's voice was smooth but measured. Neither. A flick of her hand, and the display shifted. Data unraveled before them. Streams of genetic sequences, cellular responses, a language Graves understood but had never seen written in this way before. These are your biological markers, she said. He stepped closer, scanning the display. What he saw made his breath catch. His DNA structure was shifting, not in small, gradual mutations, but in real time. He had known something was wrong. No, different, since the experiment. He had felt it in the way his body had absorbed the foreign substance, how he had adjusted instead of resisted. But seeing it now, laid out before him in stark, undeniable clarity, was something else entirely. His voice was quieter when he spoke again. What did you do to me? Zalziren finally turned, her expression unreadable. We introduced a controlled anomaly to observe your biological limits. He clenched his jaw. And you did not reject it, she said. You did not fight it. You became something else. A silence stretched between them, filled only by the hum of the ship around them. Graves inhaled slowly. How much of me is still me? Her gaze lingered on him for a fraction longer than necessary. That is what we must determine. He looked back at the display. The strands of his DNA pulsed, rearranging themselves as if responding to an unseen command. He felt fine, normal even, and yet, he knew that normal had left him the moment the needle had touched his skin. What happens if this doesn't stop, he asked. Zalziren didn't answer immediately. And in that pause, Graves understood. She didn't know. For all the Vraxian mastery over their own genetics, this was beyond them. And that was what unsettled her. He turned back to her. You didn't bring me here just to show me this. What aren't you saying? Zalziren held his gaze. I do not believe this is a mutation. Graves frowned. Then what? She studied him, and for the first time since he had met her, her voice carried something other than certainty. Evolution. The weight of the word settled between them. He exhaled, running a hand over his face. So let me get this straight. You were worried my species was too adaptable, too unstable, and now you're telling me I might be something new entirely? Yes. Graves let out a humorless laugh. Fantastic. Her expression did not change. This changes everything. No kidding, he muttered. He turned away, pressing his hands against the edge of the console. His reflection stared back at him in the surface of the display. His face was the same, his body unchanged. But beneath his skin, something was shifting, rearranging itself into an answer neither of them understood yet. He exhaled. What do you want from me, Zalziren? Her answer was immediate. Your cooperation. He turned his head, meeting her gaze. And if I say no, her mandibles twitched just slightly. Then I will find another way. Not a threat, not an ultimatum, just fact. He sighed, looking back at the display. The Vraxians controlled their own evolution. Humans let it happen. And now, here he was, standing at the center of a problem neither species had prepared for. He had a choice. But the truth was, he already knew what he would do. He looked at Zalziren once more, and this time, he saw the faintest flicker of something in her eyes. Not calculation, not control. Possibility. And for the first time since this had begun, he wondered if she feared that more than anything else. The ship moved through the void, a silent predator gliding through the unseen currents of space. Within its vast corridors, the air remained cool, unchanging, as if the passage of time itself had no place here. The Vraxians had built their world upon control, upon the eradication of uncertainty. Yet something had entered their domain that could not be quantified, something that defied their rigid structure. Ethan Graves was no longer merely an anomaly. He was the first of something new. He stood in the dim glow of the laboratory's shifting displays, watching his own genetic sequence unravel and reform, an endless process of adaptation. The realization that his body was no longer entirely his own had settled into his mind like a stone at the bottom of a deep lake, heavy, unmoving, irreversible. Zalzyran stood beside him, motionless but not indifferent. Her dark, layered eyes followed the data, but Graves knew she wasn't just reading it. She was interpreting it, trying to find the pattern that had eluded her species for so long. Finally, she spoke. "You are no longer human." Graves exhaled sharply. "That's a hell of an opener." She turned to face him fully, her posture as precise as ever, yet something in her stance had changed. Before, she had looked at him like a puzzle to be solved. Now, there was something closer to recognition. "You have become something beyond human," she continued. "But you're not Vraxian either. You are unclassified." Graves ran a hand through his hair. "Great. So I'm a glitch." "No." She studied him with something bordering on curiosity. "You are evolution, raw and unchecked. It is inefficient." Graves let out a short laugh. "Inefficient? My entire species survived because of this so-called inefficiency." Zalzyran tilted her head slightly, an acknowledgement rather than agreement. "It is unpredictable. That's what makes it dangerous." She regarded him for a moment before speaking again. "And useful." He turned toward her. "That why you kept me alive? Because I might be useful?" She did not deny it. Graves crossed his arms, nodding to the shifting display. "So what now? You try to replicate whatever's happening to me? Breed it into your species?" Zalzyran was silent for a long moment. Then, to his surprise, she said no. That caught him off guard. She continued, voice calm but edged with something heavier. "Our kind controls its own evolution, but control has limits. We have reached ours." She gestured toward the data, flickering across the screens. "You have no limits." Graves frowned. "That's not exactly comforting." "For them?" she asked, gesturing toward the unseen presence of the Dominion's leadership. "No, it is terrifying." Understanding clicked into place. "That's why they wanted me gone," Graves murmured. "It's not just about control. It's about the end of their way of life." Zalzyran inclined her head slightly. "If we do not evolve, we will perish. But if we evolve in a way we cannot regulate, we may become something unrecognizable." Graves looked at the display again, watching his genetic markers shift and settle. He understood now. The Vraxians had shaped themselves into something absolute. He was the opposite, constantly in flux, and they had no way of knowing if that was a gift or a threat. He turned back to her. "So what happens now?" Zalzyran regarded him, the weight of a decision settling behind her gaze. "That depends on you." Graves narrowed his eyes. "Meaning, you cannot remain here," she said simply. A cold realization settled over him. "You're letting me go. I'm giving you a choice." He shook his head, exhaling. "You're going to have a hell of a time explaining that to your council." Her mandibles twitched slightly. "I have already calculated the risks." Graves smirked, and she met his gaze. "There are too many unknowns." It was the closest thing to an admission of uncertainty he had ever heard from her. She stepped closer, her towering form casting a long shadow over him. "There is a ship prepared. You will take it. You will leave Vraxian space." Graves searched her expression for deception, but found none. "And if I refuse?" She was silent for a beat too long. Then, softly, she said, "Then they will come for you. Not I will come for you. They." For the first time, Graves saw the full picture. Zalzyran was not just protecting the Empire from him. She was protecting him from the Empire. He exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. "So that's it? I just disappear? For now." She turned away, inputting something into the console. The displays faded, leaving them in the dim glow of the ship's core systems. Graves watched her, weighing the moment carefully. "You're making a mistake," he said quietly. Zalzyran's mandibles clicked in amusement. "Perhaps." He hesitated before speaking again. "A minute about yourself." She paused. That single fraction of a second of stillness was enough to tell him she understood exactly what he meant. Then, as if the moment had never happened, she straightened. Your ship is waiting." Graves exhaled sharply, turning toward the door. He walked to the threshold, but stopped just before stepping through. He looked back at her one last time. She had already turned away, but he knew she was listening. "I think you're more human than you'd like to admit," he said. The door sealed behind him before he could see if she reacted. He left the Vraxian ship in silence, his own vessel cutting through the dark, heading toward the unknown. And behind him, aboard the ship of an empire built on order, an empress stood alone in the cold glow of an empty laboratory, watching a display screen filled with data she no longer understood.